Golan Heights, September 2014. The sun pressed flat against a low metal warehouse, the heat making the corrugated roof sing in a thin, metallic tone. Dust rose in blue halos when a pair of boots disturbed the shipment pallets. And in the dim center of the room, under a strip of weak fluorescent light, lay a wooden crate with a faded export label and a small tamper evidence sticker that, to an untrained eye, meant nothing. For weeks, the crate had shuffled between yards and depots, inhaling diesel fumes and the oily tang of port air, carrying with it the smell of pine and old glue that clung to splinters like a protective memory. To local buyers, it was one more municipal import, a crate no different from the others. To one small cell in southern Syria, it represented a delivery that would change a map of influence. To a team in a low, windowless room across a border, it was the single trace that would allow a long-term plan to work without ever stepping over a line. The man who signed customs receipts and smiled at visiting inspectors was known publicly as Amar Haddad, a logistics consultant with legitimate credentials who turned up at local trade fairs and prensa events. He wore neat shirts, answered emails within hours, and posted family photos that showed nothing more dangerous than a son with a soccer ball. Yet at night, messages routed through encrypted channels, short coded phrases slipped into innocuous business inquiries, and meetings in safe houses by the ruins of a village told a different story. He was a freight broker by day and a facilitator of arms movement by choice and profit by night. We will trace how a formal intelligence service detected, dissected, and disrupted a Syrian arms convoy without crossing the border, how quotidian paperwork and a small object of shipping bureaucracy became the point of leverage for a cross-border solution, and why the ethical questions raised then still haunt policymakers today. Based on intercepted communications, port manifests, testimony from former field operators, and forensic examination of transportation metadata, we reconstruct decisions minute by minute. If you value deep investigations of clandestine operations and moral complexity, subscribe and help this research reach more people. Next, we return to the warehouse and the little sticker that started everything, and follow the paper trail that should have been invisible. In the warehouse, the crate sat under a smear of dust. The sticker was round, its adhesive weakened like the rest of the label, but tucked beneath it was a marker number that matched a batch of customs declarations filed in a port far inland. An analyst named Rachel Levy noticed the repeat sequence while cross-checking shipments to a company that, on paper, manufactured agricultural equipment. She read the fields aloud in the quiet room while the air conditioner clicked and a mug of coffee steamed beside the keyboard. The monitor glowed with rows of data. The faint smell of burnt sugar from the coffee mixing with the antiseptic of old paper. Her voice was steady, but she kept repeating a pattern, the way a detective circles a map. "We have 3 identical consignments flagged to the same broker," she said. In the next chair, Avi Ben-Ari, a field handler whose hands had carried cash and forged signatures in 3 continents, tilted his head and asked if the broker had Cyanum contacts. "Possibly," Rachel answered, "but the routing suggests a corridor through lightly policed roads and a series of transits that match known arms delivery patterns." David Abramov, the liaison responsible for coordination with external agencies, sipped his coffee and asked about plausible deniability. "We cannot cross," he said, "so any option must leave no trace back to us." The small group around the screen used quiet tones, like surgeons. Names surfaced then, like tools. Colonel Amir Saeed, the Syrian handler. Layla Mansour, the courier. Kareem Ferris, the truck driver. Sami Haddad, the customs clerk whose signature appeared on several documents. Hannah Cohen, the analyst in Tel Aviv who had first flagged the metadata anomaly. And Major Cohen, the operations director who would have to decide whether to act. Each name carried an image. A cigarette stub, the rasp of gravel under tires. A blue scarf. The nervous laughter of a driver who had never been asked about his manifest. The scene that unfolded in the planning cell was a room of low light, A whiteboard covered in routes drawn with different colored markers. A felt pen pressed so hard that the ink bled through the sheet and left ghost tracks on the wall. The conversation that night became a slow choreography of risk assessment. "If we tip the receiving party, the convoy will scatter," Avi said quietly, the hum of the air conditioning punctuating his words. "If we disrupt stops along the way, we might avoid bodies but lose the trail." Hannah, whose voice had the clipped cadence of someone used to delivering hard news, replied, "We have a window where the convoy consolidates at a transit node. We could interrupt communications without kinetic action and force a delay long enough for diplomatic pressure to build." Major Cohen rubbed his temple and asked, "Will delay suffice to dismantle their capacity?" The analyst Rachel answered with a list of consequences, each one sensible and treacherous. "Delay gives us time to expose the network of brokers, but it also risks alerting them to our discovery." The debate stretched long into the night, and the room smelled of stale coffee, printer toner, and the metallic tang of adrenaline. This was a meeting where language was surgical and metaphors were weapons. Dialogue kept the scene alive in detail. "What about a false manifest sent downstream?" David suggested. "Would that cause a detour?" Hannah replied cautiously, "It would if it carried convincing credentials. But that introduces forgeries into a legal chain, and we cannot allow a paper trail." "We might later be asked to explain. We need to keep it clean," Major Cohen said. "No signatures we cannot stand by." The options were narrowed, then narrowed again, until one plan remained plausible, surgical in its restraint, invisible by design, and reliant on information rather than explosive force. The backstory of the protagonist at the center of the disruption is essential to understand motive, method, and moral friction. Amar Haddad was born in a town that straddled borders where languages mixed and loyalties braided into survival strategies. As a child, he watched trucks pass and fathers whisper that borders were lines to be crossed for the right price. His early life held the scent of diesel and bread markets, evenings of heated debate about regimes and survival, and a willingness to barter loyalties for security. He studied logistics in a municipal college, learned to read shipping codes, and took a job at a small import firm where he learned the names of ports, the cadence of manifest numbers, and the informal economies that turned surplus into profit. His work as a consultant took him to trade fairs in Beirut and Damascus, where he smiled and extended hands that hid the currency of complicity. The second element of his backstory falls into a darker turn. A brother detained for political reasons hardened Amar. He saw how networks collapsed under pressure and how a single convoy delayed could mean the difference between release and disappearance. He met Colonel Amir Saeed at a funeral, then later over tea, and the conversation about shortages and supplies muttered into business propositions. He became a bridge between licit cargo and extra-legal freight, rationalizing as necessity what others would name greed. The third element of his history is the sensory memory that stayed with those who knew him. The way his hands trembled when he signed paperwork under stress. The fake tan of a man who had spent too many nights in warehouses. The scent of his aftershave that mixed with diesel when he climbed into trucks. This human detail complicates the picture. He was not a monster straightforwardly. He was a man defined by the choices available in a violent landscape. That backstory, about 900 characters in total, explains why the crate meant more than wood and staples. It explains how someone with paperwork and credibility can become an actor in a clandestine supply chain. From those origins, the narrative moves to the environment where the convoy streamed and where intelligence activity found its leverage. The northern approaches were a lattice of rural roads, checkpoints held by local militias whose loyalties fluctuated with each payroll, and small depots masquerading as agricultural warehouses. The city center had stale air, the smell of bread from a bakery that opened before dawn, and the constant background of motorbikes. Traders named Yusuf and Nabil ran small brokerage houses where documents could be altered for a fee. The control points at the edge of the province were ad hoc. Tents of canvas and wood, where guards accepted bribes and where a single convincing credential could mean passage. This geography mattered. It created corridors that intelligence analysts had mapped and remapped, annotated with satellite images, witness interviews, and traffic logs. Among operatives, the corridor was referred to by its main waypoint names: Rabaa Market, the Qasim Crossing, and a depot known as Warehouse 7. Each waypoint had a scent memory attached: the sweet rot of spilled fruits at Rabaa, the dust and burning plastic at Qasim, the oil and sawdust at Warehouse 7. Field agents who had watched convoys described the rhythm as almost musical, a cadence of stops that permitted checks and transfers. The intelligence failure that had allowed the cell to amass cargo in the first place was not a lack of will, but a fracture of focus. Different agencies had overlapping priorities. A think tank report from the capital had argued that focusing on chemical threats made sense, while a regional police unit had limited resources to follow every truck. Interception capabilities existed in theory, but in practice were deployed against higher-profile targets. The metadata signature that Rachel found in the crate labels was a small anomaly buried in a flood of legitimate data. An intercept of a satellite phone call provided a fragmentary confirmation, but not enough to locate the convoy in real time. This gap revealed a bureaucratic truth about intelligence work. Priorities and budget lines shape what is actionable. Interception capabilities existed in theory, but in practice were deployed against higher-profile targets. The metadata signature that Rachel found in the crate labels was a small anomaly buried in a flood of legitimate data. An intercept of a satellite phone call provided a fragmentary confirmation, but not enough to locate the convoy in real time. This gap revealed a bureaucratic truth about intelligence work. Priorities and budget lines shape what is actionable. In a tense exchange captured in transcripts, 3 officials argued about jurisdiction. "This is a cross-border crime," one said in a clipped tone, "but the routes are within our capability to influence." Another answered, "Our legal mandate stops at the border. Any direct action would be political poison." The fragmentation of authority produced a window for the cell to operate. The planning in headquarters then shifted from what was forbidden to what could be done with legal and ethical constraints observed. A meeting convened in a secure room in a building with low ceilings smelled of printer ink and staple remover. The mood was both technical and moral. "We will not engage in a kinetic strike," Major Cohen said calmly, "but we can engineer a denial of passage that does not touch weapons but denies movement." The options they debated included shutting smaller crossings through diplomatic pressure, using commercial intelligence to delay permits, and creating supply chain friction by exposing broker identities to their partners. Each option had the advantage of being non-kinetic while leveraging the interconnectedness of modern logistics, where a single missing document could delay an entire convoy. The technical description of the intervention must remain non-actionable, yet specific enough to satisfy scrutiny. Analysts employed a method of supply chain disruption that relied on metadata correlation, forged yet plausible administrative errors, and timed alerts to commercial partners. They injected verified but low-level discrepancies into manifests, triggered compliance audits through partner channels, and synchronized notifications to financial institutions. Flag suspicious transactions. The operation focused on information manipulation rather than physical interdiction. In technical terms, the team exploited public and private verification procedures, using what economists call soft friction to halt movement. The operative details described here avoid procedural instruction on how to construct such measures while explaining, in 2 to 3 sentences and about 300 characters, the general process. Analysts cross-matched manifest metadata with bank transfers and port receipts, flagged mismatches through partner compliance units, and relied on downstream verification delays to stall transportation legally. The logistics of the delivery were intricate. The convoy consisted ostensibly of agricultural trucks with false bed covers, drivers holding forged papers provided by Sami Haddad, the customs clerk whose routine had been purchased by payments arriving under the name of a shell company. The Cyanin network provided safe havens where the cargo could be temporarily consolidated. Layla Mansour, the courier, was responsible for transferring small crates between vehicles at night. Karim Ferris drove one of the main trucks and hummed old folk songs to pass the hours. Each actor played a small role. The plan to disrupt depended on introducing legal and administrative friction precisely when the convoy stopped to refuel and reconsolidate. Contacts in neighboring countries were asked to enforce routine inspection protocols and to delay issuance of transit permits pending additional verification. This was diplomacy turned into a tool of containment. The night of execution had the tensity of a tightly wound coil. The field reports smelled of diesel and rain as clouds began to push inland. The convoy slowed at a checkpoint under a sky that smelt faintly of ozone, drivers complaining about procedures that now took longer for unknown reasons. The first moment of true tension occurred when Karim noticed an officer asking for a particular stamp he had never been asked for. He felt a coldness in his hands and remembered the first time he was stopped in a similar way years before, a memory that made him consider running. The second moment arrived when Layla received a message telling her to postpone the transfer. Her mind flashed to the face of Colonel Saeed and to the promise of payment. She hesitated and then typed back a short refusal that carried the force of resignation. The third moment was the longest and involved Ammar when he saw a manifest return with a margin note he had not authorized. He sat in his car, feeling the weight of the building on his shoulders and a child of many choices replaying in his head as if in slow motion. Each moment combined interior decision, flash memory of past penalties, and a judgment call that shifted the convoy from movement to stasis. The immediate aftermath was bureaucratic rather than cinematic. Trucks idled, requests for additional documentation were logged, and a municipal police unit issued an administrative hold while port authorities awaited confirmation. In the warehouse, the crate remained sealed, its sticker a small witness to the event. Press reported minor delays and quoted officials on routine checks. No explosion, no firefight. Yet the operational effect was decisive. The convoy was held for several days, during which the network, backstopped by Colonel Saeed, lost confidence and funds shifted away from the project. Arrests followed months later in adjacent provinces, based on a combination of the original logistical evidence and later witness statements. In the police station, the chain of custody of documents became a central piece of evidence. Forensics examined the ink, paper fibers, and serial numbers on transport invoices to build legal cases against brokers. The procedural description of financial and document forensics occupies a brief technical note in records. Handwriting analysis, metadata verification, and bank audit trails combine to produce an evidentiary chain admissible in court. That description is limited to high-level processes and avoids giving operational instructions. Public reaction was muted at first. Press releasing used official language that emphasized routine inspections and border cooperation. Local diplomats issued statements praising improved cross-border collaboration. Silence from higher offices followed, a diplomatic calculus that preferred ambiguity to explicit admission of intelligence action. Think tanks debated the operation, and security journals published dry articles about supply chain vulnerabilities. The debate and editorials split along familiar lines. Some argued that non-kinetic disruption that prevented weapons movement saved lives and respected the border. Others asked whether manipulating commercial verification systems and leveraging private sector compliance mechanisms without public debate risked eroding transparency and legal norms. At about one-third into this narrative, and after you have heard the life double of the protagonist and the bureaucratic surgery that followed, we pause to invite you to reflect and participate. If you felt a chill when you realized how ordinary papers could channel violence into safe passage, you are not alone. Tell us in the comments what you think. Begin your answer with justifiable or unjustifiable, and explain in 2 sentences whether operations of this sort are acceptable when they avoid open conflict. Your responses inform how we examine the moral cost of clandestine prevention and guide our future reporting. Returning to the sequence, witnesses emerged who described how financial flows were rerouted, how a driver named Karim vanished for a week before resurfacing in a neighboring town with new identity papers, and how Layla received fewer transfers afterwards. Officially, the matter was closed as administrative irregularities in trade documentation. Unofficially, regional police pursued a series of low-profile arrests that took months to coalesce, each arrest a small thread that exposed a larger cloth. The legal proceedings relied heavily on documentary evidence assembled by forensic accountants and compliance officers for banks and shipping firms. Papers, receipts, emails, and phone logs were cross-referenced. The indictments named brokers, clerks, and facilitators, not the intelligence service that had created the obstruction. The strategic effect on the cell was immediate and meaningful. They lost momentum, suppliers withdrew, and external funders reallocated their money to lower-risk ventures. But the ideology that motivated such logistics did not vanish. It adapted, moved more invisibly, and sought new corridors. The longer-term repercussions were debated in halls of policy where analysts argued over precedent. Critics warned that normalizing the use of information manipulation as a statecraft tool risked sliding into abuse. Proponents countered that nonviolent interdictions were the least harmful method available. The epilogue traces tangible developments over time and the human effects that records do not always capture. 1 month after the Operation Amar Haddad had disappeared from public records. Phones tied to his businesses had been disconnected and his social account scrubbed. Local sources reported that he had fled into rural safe houses. His son moved to a relative in another city and that his consultancy had dissolved. The immediate legal chain left open the possibility of arrest, but no formal charges were issued publicly. Families of accused brokers filed civil suits over lost income and alleged mistreatment. The operational lesson was clear. A small intervention in a supply chain can yield immediate disruption and buy time, but it does not cure the underlying conditions that create demand. 3 months later, the regional network had reconstituted with new brokers, altered routes that avoided the nodes exposed in recent months, and an increase in the use of smaller shipments that would be harder to detect. Think tanks published analyses of adaptive behavior in illicit markets and proposed stronger cross-border regulatory cooperation. A parliamentary committee in a neighboring country debated whether to tighten compliance in trade corridors, and banks updated their due diligence protocols. The cell that had been disrupted was less coherent, but not eradicated. 6 months on, the tactical victories had translated into a modest strategic advantage. Several mid-level facilitators had been detained in cooperation between police forces. Financial tracking had become more robust in certain corridors, and the credibility of the specific broker network had suffered. Yet new actors had filled the vacuum, demonstrating the resilience of illicit supply chains. The moral ledger remained unsettled. The families of those arrested complained of opaque processes and a lack of transparent oversight. International law scholars asked whether a model of preventive information interference could be reconciled with legal norms guarding due process and state sovereignty. Operationally, the intelligence community wrote internal after-action reviews that emphasized minimal footprint operations that avoid kinetic escalations and stressed the necessity of maintaining plausible deniability when operating in sensitive regional theaters. The debate continues. In the quiet that followed, there were human details that persisted. Kareem greeting an old friend at a market with nerves in his laugh. A customs clerk named Sami finding himself unable to sleep after news reports. A woman named Layla taking a job in a bakery because she preferred kneading dough to running at night. These small narratives illustrate that operations involve people whose lives shift in ways official communiques rarely admit. Conclusion. The wooden crate with the faded sticker did not detonate or explode. Yet it became a pivot around which choices were made that altered the movement of arms and money. The non-kinetic approach succeeded in delaying a convoy and in producing a legal record that supported arrests months later. But it left intact the conditions that manufacture demand and expertise. Was the operation a prudent act of preventative statecraft, or a clandestine manipulation of private systems that sets a troubling precedent? The question is hard and persistent. Tell us what you think in the comments, and begin your response with justifiable or unjustifiable to keep the conversation focused. If you value investigations that pull at the threads of secrecy and illuminate the technical and moral trade-offs at play, subscribe to the channel to receive more cases like this and to help keep this kind of reporting alive. In the end, the memorable image is of a mundane crate on a warehouse floor whose sticker became the fulcrum of a decision to choose information over violence and to favor containment that would not be traced to a state actor. In a world of shadows, choosing to act without leaving a footprint is both a tactical virtue and an ethical question that will follow those who decide. Subscribe for more investigations and to join a community that digs into these dilemmas with documents, testimony, and analysis.